of 1812. It was the latter part of the war. This would have been 1814. Native Americans had come down into this region for hunting purposes and so forth throughout the War of 1812. Our population in the state of Illinois at that time, according to Governor John Reynolds, there were about 5,000 European American settlers living here in the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys in this part of the state of Illinois. So there's only about 5,000 European Americans like us living here in that region. It was very sparsely populated. Altogether, they were surrounded by about 100,000 Native Americans. The Indians that lived here would have been Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Wee, Pinkasaws, several other tribes. Most of them lived during the War of 1812 in the north central part of the state, up around Ottawa, LaSalle, Peru, up in the Illinois River valleys. Pretty significant group of Potawatomis lived in the Chicago region, where they traded at Fort Dearborn. That was an American fort that was located up there right in what is now downtown Chicago, right at Michigan Drive and Wacker Drive, right there at the Chicago River entrance to Lake Michigan. But altogether, there was a very sparse population. This area down here was more hunting territory, where the Native Americans would come down here and hunt with the settlers. The earliest tribes that lived here had been called the Illini tribes, just like our Illini, the mascot that they have up at the University of Illinois. The Illini tribes were about 15 tribes that had just small bands of family tribes that lived throughout this part of the state. They had always traded with the early French traders down in the southwestern corner of the state. By the time of the War of 1812, most of the Illini tribes had actually become extinct. Some of them had moved out to Oklahoma. The Tamaroa and the Peoria, I believe, ended up moving out to the Oklahoma regions. They were probably the last remaining tribes from the Illini Federation. Most of them had actually died off from European diseases, and the other tribes, the Potawatomi and the Kickapoo, didn't like the fact that the Illini were affiliated with the French, so they would fight against them. So there was a lot of infighting among the tribes themselves. So that tribe that had lived right here in our region had virtually become extinct. Now, the arrowheads and so forth, the artifacts that we find, do any of you guys have any arrowheads? Seen arrowheads or have some of them? The arrowheads and the artifacts that we find here in southern Illinois actually date back almost 2,000 years. When Jesus was teaching on the Galilee, that is when the tribes were here that were creating the stone artifacts that we find today. They were part of what we call now the Cahokia mound culture. This is the great Indian mounds are down at Cahokia. You drive by it on Interstate 70 on the way to St. Louis. We're talking history of 2,000 years ago. We don't even really know the name of that tribe. They call them the Cahokia tribe now. But that was a very early Indian culture. That was like 100,000 Native Americans that lived in that region at that time and were trading with all these little villages that were scattered out here in this area. So even the Indians that our ancestors encountered during the War of 1812 referred to them as the ancient ones. So the artifacts we actually find today date back about 2,000 years. There was a significant population here then, but by the time of the War of 1812, it was greatly diminished. There was about 100,000 Native Americans that literally, that's all there was here in the state. So there wasn't a huge population base, but there were enough here to create some trouble. The Indians would come down here in the fall of the year on hunting expeditions, and that's what basically happened here at Hills Fort. They were down here for the purpose of attacking this fort. Governor Edwards, as I mentioned, had been writing letters to the Congress asking for support, asking for troops to come out here to help protect the area. There just simply weren't any troops here. They were fighting the British on the East Coast, fighting in sea battles and so forth, and we just didn't have the manpower in this country to do that. Governor Edwards and all the other territorial governors, when they strengthened the frontiers with the forts, they formed up ranger companies. Both Eric and I, Bill Johnson, Bill Wilson, a number of others that are involved in our society had ancestors that fought in these ranger companies. You get together a group of men, very little training, they provided their own horse, provided their own gun, and they would become a ranger troop where you would have like a dozen rangers that would be members, population from here in Illinois. They would ride from fort to fort. They would ride from Hills Fort down to Greens Fort, up to Lindley's Fort. They would go down to Carlisle, to John Hill's Fort. They would go over to Aviston, Illinois today, where Journey's Fort was, on over to Lebanon, where Chambers Fort was. And that would show kind of a strength of force where the Native Americans wouldn't attack these areas. They very rarely attacked a fortified installation.